Hey, good day, everyone. This is Glenn, your friendly epidemiologist. So Rebecca, my sister, is unable to join us today. So today I will just be going through some of the questions that people had through the week and any of your questions that you have tonight. All right, so let me just log on here. Okay, here I am. So first, I'm just going to go through where we are, what this past week looked like. So we've continued our uncontrolled ascent into an experience we have not seen in many decades in the United States. And so let's go into what we're looking at. So in the past week, we had approximately 400,000 new diagnosed cases. And so this is higher than what we've seen so far with this illness in terms of reported cases. However, in terms of actual infections, so it's a challenge to figure out what the actual number of infections are relative to the reported diagnosed cases. And so if you can see my screen here, we're thinking probably the best estimate is between 400 and 500,000 new daily infections. And the reason is, I can jump ahead for a second and then jump back. The reason is this graph. So in many states, we're seeing a positive test result that's exceeding 15% or 20%. And what that means is that there's not enough testing going on and that they're reserving tests at that point for only symptomatic people or the very highest risk people. Also, you have to remember for testing, a lot of people require numerous tests. So for instance, it's standard practice at many hospitals or for many physicians to get tested at least once a week, just to ensure that there's no infection that they might spread onto their patients. Among people who test positive, they're typically tested multiple times because at some point you want to see when they become negative again, when they've cleared the virus. And so a lot of people get multiple tests. So that means that this rate is a little bit confusing to interpret, but it's still pretty good generally when you compare across different things, across time, across regions, etc. But getting back for what I was just saying about the why we think there's such a huge undercount. So when you have these numbers of percent positive that are so high, there's no way to get that number unless you're just simply not testing enough people. And so that means that you're mostly just testing people that you are highly confident have it, and you're not really doing widespread screening to see how common it is in the population. So that means in a lot of states where there's not much testing going on, so let's even say regions, like so in the South, for instance, and the West, we're barely scratching the surface here in terms of the number of infections. We can have high confidence in the Northeast of the United States that we are screening pretty regularly, because the only way to get these numbers so low, this is a little bit dated at this point, you see it's July 3rd, so it's around a week ago. I didn't capture a more recent one, but the trends are the same. It's gone up a little bit in the Midwest, it's gone up a lot in the South, and it's gone up in the West. But the only way in the Northeast to get it so low is if you are screening in very widespread. So you're really capturing a lot of asymptomatic people. In this case, again, it's mostly symptomatic. Let me jump back up here. So nationwide, we see again this continual climb in daily tests, but the spike in daily cases is a far steeper line than the number of new tests. So clearly these are new cases that we're seeing. Next is the currently hospitalized, and you see that this is spiking up, particularly in recent days. The spikes have started to get even steeper, which is unfortunate. And also in recent days, a lot of people have been saying, why aren't there more deaths? And the epidemiologists have been saying, well, there's a bunch of reasons for that, but they will come, and they are starting to come. And we'll get into that a little bit later. There's essentially 7 reasons I've identified for why the deaths are lagging, and none of them are really good news, because it means that the death rate is likely to spike in the coming weeks. All right, where are the hotspots in the United States? So there's a couple ways of looking at this. The first way to look at this is new cases. So if you look at just raw numbers of new cases, then if you're looking at Florida, it has a lot of people there. Texas has a lot of people. California has quite a lot. And then the ones in dark orange are also a lot, but although not as much as these dark purple ones. But so these are daily cases, just totals. But as epidemiologists, we remember that it's better to normalize it, because otherwise it's hard to compare. How many people are there in each state? So if there's a huge number of people, California is huge, then how does this compare to a state like Tennessee, where there's far, far less people that live there? And so how do the numbers compare? And so a better way to look at this, I still like looking at this because the absolute numbers are important, but I also like looking at it this way. And so this is a way, what we call normalization, where you use some common reference point in terms of the number of people who live there. So sometimes it's reported as the cases per million, or the cases per 100,000. But so this shows you relatively how many new cases there are relative to the size of the population. And so as an example, look at California again. So California is third in the country in terms of new daily cases total. But when you look at it as a percentage of their whole population, it's actually not the same rate. And so we need to keep that into consideration. When you look at it as a percentage of the population, then you see that it shifts a little bit. So rather than looking at Florida, Texas, and California, now the rates become Arizona, Louisiana, and Florida. And so why is this important? It's important for a few reasons. One, just in terms of interpreting where the hotspots are, how much this is spreading. But also, whoops, give me 1 second. I'm gonna mute. Oh. All right. And so this is important, one, in terms of the rate, but then two, as we think about this concept of herd immunity, which again has not been proven to actually exist yet for this disease. We can get more into that later if you'd like. But if we do achieve herd immunity, or we do achieve this burnout concept, then what this means is that this will tell us the rate per population when we approach that number. Right now, this graphic won't, because it's new cases per million, whereas herd immunity concept would be total cases per million, assuming that there's persistent protective immunity of people who get infected, which we have strong reason to be skeptical about at this point. But here's what we're looking at. And so you see that in the South, in particular, as well as the West, it is out of control, and it's worrisome. I'm going to look a little bit more in terms of regionally what we're looking at here. So the Northeast has continued to be pretty constant. The reason that we are not seeing huge uncontrolled growth in the Northeast is a single reason. And that one reason is that we have good contact tracing and testing. And so I guess the third reason would be that we also have the policy of wearing masks outside, outdoor social distancing, all of these other things. But those best practices have also been communicated in the Midwest, the South, and the West. So clearly in the South, the Midwest, and the West, they're also saying, oh, everyone needs to social distance themselves, everyone needs to be wearing masks. So the policy communication is the same, yet we're not seeing tremendous growth in the Northeast. And one of the big reasons for that, we might be more adherent to the policies here, but another big reason is for every new case that's identified and test positive, we have an army of people that go after them in the Northeast to identify who they might have come into contact with and potentially exposed, and test all of them and quarantine them for a couple of days until they get the results. The rapid test you can typically get pretty fast. It doesn't require quarantine. And to see who they got it from, to ensure that every single person is traced along the way. And because they've been pretty effective, they haven't been 100% effective. If they were 100% effective, then you'd see the new cases drop even further. But they're effective enough that they're keeping it at bay. And we're seeing roughly the same. You can see that it's not much growth. It's roughly the same amount on a daily basis. So the Northeast is doing a great job. And this is the goal. This was the goal for every part of the country, that once we got out of lockdown, we'd have really good contact tracing and testing that would keep the rates low across the country. But because these regions because they chose not to have extensive testing and contact tracing, then this is the only outcome that we would expect. Just a couple more slides and I can go on to some other things. So first, I showed this last week and I'll show the update this week again. You see that there's some states that are driving it here in terms of the number of per capita, so normalized growth. And you see that Arizona is up here, Florida, some of the states that we just mentioned a little earlier. This one, I wanted to come in on to Texas specifically, and we'll talk about the death rate a little bit further a little later. But you'll notice when we look at the national level, there's a little bit of an uptick of deaths. But then when you start to click in on specific states, and all I pulled out for tonight was Texas, you see a sharp jump in death rate now. And so this is what we're going to start to see in other states as well. A lot of folks were skeptical in Texas and in the South that this was a serious disease. And then the cases started to rise and they were still skeptical. And then the hospitalization started to rise and they were still skeptical. And now the death rates are rising. And there's no way to stop that until they do a lockdown at this point. They've passed the point of no return and lockdown is required at this point. And it's a question of when, not if. When you look at the shape of the curve of new deaths, you see if you restrict it only to these 5 states that are the biggest in the country right now, Arizona, California, Florida, South Carolina, and Texas, you see that the uptake curve is quite clear, and the shape of the curve is getting steeper and steeper with each passing week. And when you combine all other states, you see that we saw earlier, just when you look at these other states over here, there are a lot of states in trouble right now, but some are further along than others in terms of the how long it's been really hitting the state hard. And so because of the lag and these other reasons we're going to be getting into, the death rate has not started climbing as much in many of these other states, but it will. The other thing is, this is just hospitalization rates. Hospitalization rates are now starting to spike up as well. This is an aberrant daily value, so it's unclear how to interpret it. It could just be, I know Florida wasn't reporting for a while, and now I think Florida is starting to report again. It looks like Hawaii and Kansas are still not reporting, but so don't look on any individual day, but you can see that the slope of hospitalization has continued to rise. All right, so that's it at a high level. Let me jump, well, I've talked about the death rate, so let me just jump right back into that. Why are the deaths going up? Oops, that's not it. All right, so as far as I can tell, there are 7 reasons why we're seeing a death delay in this case. And so I'll go through them systematically, but basically I'll just say them first here. So first, deaths lag cases. So when you have new cases, there's a lag. Next is the age thing that we've talked about previously, that younger people are getting infected more recently. There's better treatments and better testing. Summer may be helping some. There's something called the Simpsons Paradox, which I'll talk to you about tonight. And then also the underreporting misdiagnoses that I've talked about previously. So the first is the lag. So based on our experience in the Northeast and what we're seeing now, typically the time between exposure and symptom onset is on average around 5 days, maybe 6 days, depending on various aspects of what the symptoms are. We know that there's huge variation in the symptoms at this point, including everything from nervous system involvement, like a headache, to gastrointestinal issues, to traditional flu symptoms, to a whole gamut of different symptoms. Approximately 30, or let's say 25 to 40% of people don't ever have symptoms at all. They're considered asymptomatic, but we've also found, we've explored this in previous weeks, that approximately 45% to 55% of asymptomatic people have disease process that can be identified if you actually look at their clinical metrics. So even though they don't have symptoms, they do have underlying disease. And so even these glass opacities that are found in the lungs, there's sort of like this short-term lung damage, and it's not quite clear how long that will last, is found in 45 to 55% of asymptomatic people. So again, a very serious disease, and we have to keep on stressing this. So when it comes to death, this is symptoms. The time between symptoms and death is frequently around 2 weeks at this point. With better treatments and a variety of other reasons, we're pushing out the time until death. Some of the new treatments are keeping people alive longer. So that's around another 2 weeks. And then frequently there's a time between the reporting of the death and the actual death, and that might be an additional week. Because the reporting of the death to the CDC is a whole different process. Once someone dies, it's not magically conveyed. It's sort of something you have to, paperwork you have to submit, and a whole process. And when you're in the midst of your hospital is being overwhelmed and lots of people are dying, then there's frequently not a lot of effort spent to try to send this in sooner, and so it tends to lag a little bit there. So this is one reason that there's a lag, and this is almost a month in terms of what we're looking at in terms of this lag, and it's been around a month in terms of some of the rises in the cases, a little bit more than that we've been seeing. The next reason is age, and so we've talked about this a lot previously, but so just at a high level, the previous age distribution was across the entire age spectrum that we had in March and April of who was getting sick. But then after the lockdown, typically the folks who saw this themselves as the least amount of risk were the ones who were the most willing to go out, take the risks, and were the ones who ended up getting exposed and infected. And so you see a huge spike in the number of younger people and a decrease in the older folks. Next is, and so this was Ohio as an example, but if you look at CDC's reported numbers, it's the same thing. I didn't capture the spread quite as much, but you can see this pronounced increase in younger people getting infected. And so another way of saying this is we've known that younger people are at remarkably reduced risk of severe morbidity and mortality, but something I keep on emphasizing every single week, and I need to do it again this week, is that when we talk about infections, this is a viral infection. When we talk about infections, we're not talking about an individual person's risk. I know we all perceive it as we're talking about our own individual risk. What is my risk of getting serious disease or getting infected or dying ultimately if I, God forbid, got this disease? But it's not about us. When we look at the population level as epidemiologists, when you look at the spread, then you know each person is on average spreading it at this point from 1 to 2 people. Back in March and April, the average was 2 to 3 people, but we're still spreading it on average to around at least 1 other person, maybe more. And so that means that each person on average continues to spread it 1 to 1 to 1 behind them, then there's no way to keep the people behind you safe. And so this person a few weeks from now might end up dying, and this person might end up dying a few weeks from now because this person was careless and was willing to get infected. They could have chosen to stop the chain of infection, but because they were willing to get infected, the virus spread through them and then through the next person, and ultimately ended up killing other people because of their willingness to get themselves infected. So we need to keep on stressing this again and again. So now going back to the lags, here we are. All right, the third reason for the treatment delay is now for the death delay is we have some better treatments that have come on. We've talked about a bunch of these previously. So corticosteroids are effective for really quickly dampening the cytokine storm, the immune response when people are on ventilators or have severe illness that requires oxygen. There's other immunomodulatory therapies that have been starting to be used that seem like they're still have not been proven in clinical trials yet, but they're being widely used and they might be having an effect. That might be part of the reason we're not seeing as much death. Remdesivir is an antiviral. It's been identified. It's still there's some suggestion at this point that it is effective at preventing death, but right now it's only approved by the FDA for preventing hospitalization stay. But there's some really interesting results over the last week or two that suggest that there is a reduction in death, but it's still something that's being investigated. So I just saw a question: are these therapies helping prevent death, or are they just preventing hospitalization days? And so they're doing both. And so particularly remdesivir, like I mentioned, was originally permitted for widespread use because it was reducing hospitalization days. And you have to remember, hospitalization, there's two important things for that. The first and most important is that hospital beds are getting scarcer and scarcer now. There's a bunch of hospitals now in the South that have reached capacity. They are out of beds, and this is really worrisome. What they can start to do is to put extra beds in the hallways, put extra beds in the closets, similar to what we did in New York City and New Jersey, and then push patients away to the other counties that are nearby, so they can still manage some patients that way. But eventually, as the other counties around them start to fill up, then there will be nowhere to put the bodies. And this is a serious issue. In the Northeast, we luckily got near that point, but we never breached it. But that was because we shut down weeks before we came anywhere near to reaching capacity. And so because we were anticipating it, we saw what had happened in Italy, we shut down and we kept on going. So even after you shut down, then most of the exposure is within the households, as I mentioned in previous weeks. And then so you continue spreading it. And the worst thing is that when you start locking people down, then these 20, 30-year-olds who were infected start to infect everyone else in their household. And the other people they might be living with are people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so then you see a rapid shift for more severe cases and more deaths. So when you lock down, that's not the end of the cases going to the hospital. In some ways, that's just the beginning. And so there's no way to avoid the lockdown at this point. And the problem is because we've waited so long. I think that a lot of these states are waiting for a signal of the hospitals overflowing. And that is terrible because that's past the point of no return. Once the hospitals are full, we're going to continue to see weeks of additional patients requiring hospitalization, and there will be no place for them to go. That is not going to be something we're going to be used to seeing on TV. Anyway, these other things have also been found to be helpful. Oxygen, just supplementing oxygen earlier makes it so that there's less lung damage. So people, because they're not forcing air in as much, you actually can keep people alive longer. Anticoagulants, I don't know what the status is in terms of how effective they are. I don't believe they are very effective currently for the type of thrombotic events that we're seeing with COVID-19. And that's because it's not like a typical type of clot that you would have in terms of how the clots are formed. And so our current drugs don't seem to be as effective against the specific types of clots. Currently, we believe, so right now, where some of the studies are suggesting around 20 to 30% of people with COVID-19 are producing clots. And these clots are different in an important way. So the ACE2 receptor is on many cells that line the cardiovascular system, the lining of the blood vessels. And so they're part of their job, in addition to, you've heard the ACE2 receptor for blood pressure and things like that, part of their other job that the cells take care of is to clot. So if you have a traumatic event that requires immediate clotting locally, then your body can respond, and it's partly through those ACE2 receptor cells, the cells that have those receptors, that release some of these factors. And this is caused, and so because these cells are being infected, they're kind of becoming zombie cells and just spewing out all these chemicals into the bloodstream. It's causing clotting in a different way than we're used to seeing. And so right now we don't have an effective treatment. What this means is that a lot of people who get COVID-19 are not dying from lung issues at all. What they end up dying from are heart attacks, strokes, embolisms, and other thrombotic events. And so this is something we need to consider, especially if people, what we are finding a little bit is that people seem to recover, they leave the hospital, they go home, then have a heart attack or stroke at home because they thought they were cured, but the disease process was continuing on. The other thing was simply turning the patient over. This was earlier something that we found in the Northeast that was just because the lungs just fill up with all this stuff. And if you turn people over, it just makes it a little easier for people to breathe. So some of these are related to the lung failing, but what we find is it's not just the lung disease. Like I said, it's a clotting disease, and then you see multiple organs impacted and in a lot of the severe cases, or multiple organ damage. So it's still a very severe disease. But some better treatments because of some of these. This is another reason why we're delaying death. We don't know. The problem is a lot of times for these people, even if they survive, unfortunately, they're going to have lifelong issues. So there's scarring of the lungs, scarring of other organs, the strokes, the heart attacks, the stuff, even if they survive these things, they could have long-term consequences. And so yes, we are delaying death with these treatments, but surviving does not mean that they're cleared out of any trouble. A lot of these people have a lot of time of recuperation and effort ahead of them to try to get their health back. All right, the next thing is better testing. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Yes, there has been an increase in testing. You can see all the testing that's been taking place. It's increased dramatically in all regions. And so because of the testing, this is something that I mentioned a little earlier. So because of the testing, let me go here. You see that where we are now, in terms of the newly infected, previously back in March and early April, we were diagnosing far, far less people. And so the people that we were diagnosing were the ones that were already in the hospital for the most part. So we were pretty much diagnosing the sickest of the sick. Whereas now, because of more testing that we're doing, that's sort of generating this new curve that we're looking at here. So what I showed you earlier, that we have the new diagnosed cases are going way up, then that means we're doing a much, much better job of diagnosing more mild cases and people who are never going to end up in the hospital. And so that's another reason why the perceived death rate is going down. Another reason, so there's just a couple of reasons, then I'll go on to the other things. And one other thing just to demonstrate this was when you look early on in New York City, we looked at this last week, that the shape of the curve was roughly the same. So the people that were being diagnosed as cases and the uptake curve of the hospitalizations was roughly right on top of each other. It was the same day for a lot of these patients. And the death rate came quite rapidly as a result, because these were already the sickest of the sick that were going. All right, another thing that we hadn't talked about previously, or might have mentioned some of these hypotheses, we don't know yet, but it might be the case that summer is helping. And there's three main reasons why this might be the case. So one is that there's less flu going around, it's not flu season. And we know that if you get flu and COVID-19 together, then it makes you more likely to die and more likely to have severe symptoms. Another thing is that there's a hypothesis about whether vitamin D might help. There's some evidence that supports it. There's some evidence that, plenty of evidence that seems to contradict it, that it probably doesn't have much of an impact. I think it's probably still an open question. To some of evidence, I think is maybe going towards the idea that vitamin D is not really helping as much as we had hoped, but I think it still might be an open question. And then the other thing is, one thing that we've identified is that the larger the infecting dose, the more severe the disease on average. This is something that we've seen globally when the outbreak was earlier a few months ago. And basically it's this idea that if you're outside and you're further apart, even if you're exposed and you get infected, if your initial dose is very, very, very small, then you're much more likely to have the time to create a good immune response and get rid of the virus without having a really severe disease. Whereas if you're inside, you're under lockdown, and you have someone who's very sick and they're just coughing a lot, and you have the aerosols in the air and there's no way to escape it, then you're breathing that in for hours and for days. And so then it makes your risk of having severe disease and dying much greater because there's no way to escape it. And your dose before you can build an immune response is just far, far higher. That's why the lockdowns, I really, really wish we could have avoided these lockdowns. They're going to make a lot of people very sick and are going to cause a lot of death, but there's no, not because the hospitals are overflowing, there's no other way, there's no other alternative right now. All right, so that's the fifth reason. The sixth reason is something called the Simpsons Paradox. We haven't really talked about this before. It's an interesting idea. I don't know how much I buy into it right now, but there is a little bit of evidence that could be something that's going on. And so basically, I showed you this chart a little earlier in terms of the timeline, the lag. So the first orange or the yellow is this exposure, then you have symptoms during the brown period, then you have death, and then reporting of death. And so if we use that same timeline here, I just pretty much replicated it. So this is infection, symptoms, death. So if you were in a world where every single person got infected at exactly the same time, then you could very easily calculate the death rate because you would calculate the total number of people who were infected and the total number of people that died. And so then that would be very easy. All the deaths are lined up and you could capture it at one point in time. The problem is that right now, because of the way it's spreading, we can't really even look at this as an outbreak taking place in states. This is really county by county outbreaks now, way, way more outbreaks than we had back in March. Back in March, there were just a few big hotspots. Now there are many, many, many hotspots across the United States. And I'll show you the graphic next. But what this means is that first, you start seeing a lot of these cases. So the denominator, remember the infection fatality rate is deaths divided by infections. So it's the infection fatality rate. The denominator seems enormous because of all the new hotspots that are forming, but because of the lag in deaths, then it seems like the new infection fatality rate is tiny. But the problem is not that the infection fatality rate has changed. The problem is that we're spreading far, far wider, more widespread than we were back in March. And because there are so many counties and so many new hotspots that are arising almost every week, there's new hotspots now in the US, that now we're sort of going in a curve like this. And so if you were to look over time, the deaths are going to be increasing, but the cases are increasing even faster. And so now what this means is that you can't outrun death. The deaths are going to come for a lot of these patients. We can't escape it at this point, but it just means that we can't visualize it now. So a lot of people have this false belief that it seems like the infection fatality rate is low simply because there's a low number of people dying, when in reality, the number of new cases is rapidly increasing around the country. So when you look at this on a county by county level, here's the worry now with Simpson Paradox, that rather than the hotspots being just near New York City, New Jersey, a couple other places that we saw before, now we have hotspots all over the country. Each one of these is a separate hotspot. So this country is in really bad shape, and the infection fatality rate is going to come up. The disease is the disease. It hasn't, still COVID-19, it hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed are our treatments, but we don't have any miracle cures yet. And so these hotspots we're going to be seeing, we are seeing the hospitalization rate rise, and the deaths will be following in weeks. And so, like I said, so I just gave you this, was that the seventh? No, this is the sixth reason. So one more reason is the reporting. We've talked about this a lot previously, the underreporting and misdiagnosis. So a lot of times, particularly early on in the Northeast, a lot of people saw this as a lung disease. So you got COVID-19, and if you died of the lung stuff, then that was what you died of. But they weren't thinking of it as a stroke disease or a heart attack disease or any of these other organs that are impacted, gastrointestinal systems, nervous system. A lot of people weren't seeing it as these other organs that were getting sick. And so when you look at all-cause mortality, this is just a visual from back in April. You see that the all-cause mortality is quite high. I haven't seen any recent update published in the last week or two, but I'm sure they're going to be coming out again soon, and so I'll show them to you. But this is an illustration of what happened in New York City. We have here the confirmed deaths in dark blue, the probable deaths in light blue, and then all of these additional unexplained deaths. Now, one thing, before I go on to the next topic and look at the questions, one thing that I mentioned last week that I wanted to spend a little more time in was the expected deaths. Because right now, every time you see these excess deaths, it all relies on this idea that there's this concept called expected deaths, and that these are sort of like somehow extra on top, excess on top of the expected. And so the question is, well, how do we know what the expected deaths are? And so I want to just spend a little time looking at this. All right, so epidemiology, this was a previous slide, so I can go over it again for people who are new to watching it. Epidemiology, it comes from the Greek, epi and demos. Epi means upon, demos is like demography, it means population, so things that fall upon populations. And so within the study of epidemiology, one of the things is centenarians, so people who live to over 100, and we know to the person how many people are over the age of 100 in the United States. I believe that this is this is worldwide that we're looking at. There are currently over 500,000 people over the age of 100 around the world and this is great. I mean, look at the shape of this curve. A lot of people are living longer lives, healthy longer lives. And so when you look at, well, why isn't everyone living to 100? And so you can look, well, what percentage of reasons are people dying from? In the United States, the most recent graph I pulled was from 2017, so it's still a few years old, but it doesn't change very much from year to year. I'll show you in a second. But so cardiovascular disease was the highest. Cancer is next, musculoskeletal disorders. But you can see we know with precision what the distribution of reasons are for people dying. It's a little bit different when you look at the global level. So cardiovascular disease has a much larger impact globally, but then cancer and some of the others are important too. But so the reason I'm telling you this is that we know why people die at a population level really well. And I wanted to click into this a little bit more. So the most important insight here is that the cause of death, the causes don't change very much from year to year. So for instance, what we're looking at is over many decades. You can see over decades, you can see clear changes over time. But when you look from one year to the next, let's say 2010 versus 2011, the causes of death as a percentage are almost identical from year to year. If you adjust based on the average age of the population, gender, that kind of stuff, then within a very, very, very precise range, you can estimate what the total death rate will be, what the expected death rate will be, because these don't change very much from year to year. Let me dig into this even a little bit further. So in this case, we're looking at heart attacks, myocardial infarctions, and you can see the difference between men and women. You can see on an annual basis, these error bars, these little things are the precision that we have. There's so much precision because it doesn't change very much. You can see there's directionally a change, but when you look at the difference, here there was a little bit of a spike, but they're really tiny. And this was when you break it down into women. This is in men, it's from year to year, there's virtually no variation. There's a little bit, but hardly any. Here, when something changes, then it gives us a reason as epidemiologists to say, what is going on? Why is there a change here? I believe in this case, I wasn't studying heart attacks, but I believe that it was a change in reporting and some other reasons, that it was just a data issue. But a lot of people were paying attention to this. What is causing a change in heart attacks and myocardial infarction? And so, but it's well studied, because if you see a change, something is causing it, because you can predict so closely what's going on that anytime you see a bump, then that's a reason to know something is going on, because it's very different from what you would have been expecting that year. Similarly, if you break it down by age, so it's a little bit challenging to see this on the screen, but you can see that even by age, you can see very precisely how many people you'd expect to die each year from heart attacks. Like, the amount of precision is, without being an epidemiologist, you would not expect there to be so much precision. And there's a good reason for that. On an individual level, it's extremely hard to predict when an individual patient is going to die or individual person is going to die or what they're ultimately going to die from. But on a population level, you can see it's an extremely different story. At a population level, everything averages out, and we have very, very, very precise expectations with gender and age and by disease, exactly how many different people are going to be dying from things. One more thing, and then I'll move on. Just because this idea is going to be coming back, and I just need to drive it home. This expected values. So one interesting thing is that less people have been dying year over year at every age range. So people 65 and over have been living longer, both men and women. People over 85 have been living longer. People at every age range are living longer than we were decades ago. And so, but again, this is over decades and decades. The key insight here is that when you look at a specific year, there's virtually no change, very, very little change in what you're seeing. And so that means that when we talk about expected values, expected deaths, we have extraordinary confidence in the precision here. So when we talk about excess deaths that we're seeing from COVID-19, this is real. This is not just some sort of loosey-goosey assumption of, oh, there might be more deaths or something. When we look at New York City, at the expected deaths that I just shared with you, where was that? That is up here. When we look at expected deaths, we have extraordinary high confidence that these excess deaths, something is going on, they're unexplained. If it's not COVID-19, then there's some other pandemic going on because something else is explaining this that's not what you would be expecting to see based on all available data in New York City. These deaths, the obvious thing to epidemiologists is that these are just simply people are dying from heart attacks, strokes, other things, and it's being misreported and not being reported as a COVID death. All right, I saw some questions. Let me unmute and have you do it instead of me spending time. Actually, can you unmute yourself and just ask your questions? That would be the easiest.
I had a question. When you were talking about the treatments as delaying, one of the causes for delaying of death, and maybe I'm just not fully following, does that mean that the treatments are just prolonging life and then death becomes eventual? Or are they actually curative?
Well, so there's a bunch of different things. It could be that the drugs are mostly just helping the ones who would have been cured anyway. So maybe the most severe cases there's nothing we can do for them yet. And if someone gets to that point where they're really severe or they're susceptible to the really severe sequelae, the really severe ramifications of the disease, then it could be that none of these drugs are effective, and so then the death rate isn't impacted at all. I think that the death rate is demonstrated. So for instance, for sure, the corticosteroids have demonstrated that they reduce health. Oh, all right, let's put everyone back on mute again. All right. All right, so corticosteroids, yes. So corticosteroids truly do reduce death. The problem is that they don't reduce death for everyone. So for instance, they've been demonstrated if someone is approaching death, they're on a ventilator, it's shown to dramatically reduce their chance of death. If someone's on oxygen, dramatically reduces their chances of death. Not as much as if they're on a ventilator, but still it has a very substantial impact on reducing their chances of death. However, it doesn't reduce anyone else's death. So people who will ultimately die because of strokes and heart attacks and other things that we know COVID-19 is generating from all these blood clots that they form, this drug has no impact on that. It's a totally different system. So right now we are seeing progress. We are making more hospital beds available because of this. These are good findings that we have, but we're not anywhere near where we need to be, and this is still an extremely dangerous disease. Does that answer your question? Yeah. All right, please, other people, if can you please mute yourself when you're not talking, but unmute yourself now if you have any questions. Anyone out there with questions? Oh, okay, unmute yourself.
Okay. All right. What do you think about sending the kids back to school in September?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question because I've prepared a whole thing on that. I was prepared because you've asked the question earlier, as have other people during the course of the past few weeks. So let's dig into it. I can tell you from the start, I don't know. There's evidence to say we should and evidence to say we shouldn't. So let me go into each of these 8 questions. I think that if we can answer these 8 questions, then that will give us the answer about kids going back to school. And we do have data to one extent or another for each of these questions. So let me dig into these. All right, so I'll just read them off here first. Are the kids going to be safe if they go back? Are the teachers going to be safe? Will the kids bring COVID-19 home to their family and potentially put the family at risk? Do the answers vary by state? Do the answers vary by high-risk students, educators, or families? Will opening schools lead to a second wave and more lockdowns? What are the risks of not reopening? What should we do? All right, so let me go through them systematically. All right, so the first question, I tried to color code the questions a little bit based on how I thought the evidence was supporting it or not. So the first question, are the kids going to be safe? I think that there's a lot of evidence that if the kids themselves go back to school, and I'm talking under 21 for the most part, and in particular, there seems to be this really interesting, sharp impact of going through puberty. So I'm talking particularly about prepubescent kids. They seem to be at extraordinarily very, very, very low risk. So it's very safe for them. As people go through puberty, their risk increases a little bit, but even under 21, they have far, far, far less risk than even a 20-year-old or people older in their 20s or 30s or 40s. People who are under 21 in general have very, very low risk. This is consistent in what we found with studies in Chicago, Massachusetts, Italy, South Korea, Iceland, everywhere it's been studied, universally, kids have been found to be safe. So if it's the question of, are the kids going to be safe, this thing we know the answer to pretty well. Under the age of 18 in particular, let's use that as the cutoff. I'm not going to talk about college today. College is a different question. I might go into college in another week or two in terms of looking at the risk there. That's a completely different risk profile at that point, in large part because students have different risk activities that they're more likely to engage in, and it makes it much, much more complicated. But for kids in elementary school in particular, but let's say under the age of 18, the story is very clear that it's very consistent. The kids are very likely to be safe. The high-risk events like the Kawasaki disease that we talked about in previous weeks, or it's a similar sequelae to that, is extremely rare. And so this question I think we've answered. Here's another graph that I've showed previously. For people under the age of 18, the risk of death, which is the ultimate worst thing. I mean, obviously you don't want to get sick, have severe disease, get lung scarring, and have other lifelong issues. But as an indicator, you can see that it's virtually non-existent. So the kids this is not a material worry. Are the kids going to be safe? The next question is, are teachers going to be safe? And so interestingly, there have been a couple studies that have evaluated this. And so, for instance, the one we're looking at here in France, they were looking at students getting infected and then the likelihood that teachers or non-teaching staff, other people at the school, got infected. And what they found was that the risk profile of the students that was extremely low also was the same for teachers and non-teaching staff. So we have high confidence. There's not a ton of data out there. So maybe it's not as green as the first question, but we have high confidence that in terms of the teachers and the other staff at the school getting infected, that their risk is extremely low of acquiring the disease from the pupils themselves. Particularly if we have the kids wear the masks and this kind of thing. So this risk is also quite low. So this is good. All right. Will the kids bring COVID-19 home to their families? All right, so let me share. So I showed you on this graph, this was the France study of students, teachers, and non-teaching staff. This was that same study. I'm going to just make this a little bit larger. This was a retrospective study. This was in France, comparing all the people who got sick. And so there could be a worry, because what you're finding is that, so here are the pupils, here are the parents of the infected pupils, and here are the siblings of the infected pupils. So maybe it could be that the kids go home and they infect their parents and they infect their siblings. And so this might be a worry. The thing is that this was a retrospective study. So this was looking at everyone. It wasn't looking at who infected who. It was just looking at who was infected. But this gives further evidence here, because if it was the kids that were infecting other people, then most likely the kids would also be infecting the teachers and would also be infecting the other staff at the schools. They'd be using the bathrooms at the schools. They'd be having whatever poor hygiene at home. They'd have the same poor hygiene at school, I guarantee it. And so you don't see that inspection. So the fact that you do see this big jump here was, for me, provides additional evidence that it's not really anything to worry about. Most of these people are like the parents and the siblings. It probably went the other way, where it was these people that were infecting the kids that went to school. And the reason that we know this comes from a couple different studies. All right, the first, so right now I was showing you that this was France. So in China, only 5% of household clusters were found to have a child as the index case. The index case is the first one that infects the other people. So only 1 in 20 in China were found. In Switzerland and Holland, it was 8%. So of all the new infections, and kids in many of these places make up maybe 20%, give or take, of the total population, that are only accounting for a much, much smaller percentage of the new infections. So in addition to them not being at high risk of severe disease, they also are not good transmitters of disease to get other people infected. So it really helps us a lot in terms of our that we don't have to worry about this so much. So for the most part, kids will not bring it home to their families. Here's another graphic. This one is from I think this was Chicago. No, this was I forget which one this was. Chicago was looking at 15 households. 27% of infections were child to child. So this is a little bit worrisome. So it means that there is a lot more spread in the Chicago study of 15 households than what we saw either in Switzerland or China. China 5%, Switzerland 8%, Chicago maybe up to 27%. But still, so I think this was the Switzerland study. So this was that right here. These are the kids, and you see that the green ones are the ones who are infecting the others. And you see that the vast majority of the index cases of the ones infecting the others were other people in the family. And so the mother, the father were typically the ones getting it when they went out to the office, out to their leisure activities. Grandparents were sometimes the index patient, and kids were extremely, extremely rare to be. However, having said that, let me see, did I have Israel here? I'll get to Israel in a second. But so this is mixed. There's evidence for this and evidence against it. The studies that I presented to you are real studies. They're real examples. They are evidence that there is not spread among kids. I'll jump to the next one. But in Israel, there was spread, dramatic spread. And so 2 weeks after Israel fully reopened schools, this was back in May, they eliminated the class size restrictions. They opened back up May 17th with the kids wearing masks, with all the precautions. This was May. They'd been through their own first wave, and yet by June 3rd, they had to reclose after a major outbreak at the schools. The largest outbreak included over 100 students and 14 teachers at one school. So clearly there was enormous spread in Israel. This is the only example globally that we were able to find. And so I showed you lots of other studies where there was no spread. And so we don't know what was unique about this. And so the data is truly mixed. We just don't know. When Israel closed down its schools, it only identified 2 school cases. So only two kids tested positive. And yet after the lockdown, over 100 students were found to have been infected. So this is the caveat emptor for this. And so there could be new clusters, new hotspots that form. The vast majority of schools do not appear to be doing this, but the data is mixed. All right, let me jump back to some of these other important questions. Do the answers vary by state? Absolutely. So I'm talking about opening schools in the green states. So the three up here, maybe New York, parts of the Northeast, New Jersey, other parts of the Northeast, maybe some other yellow states where the amount of new infections daily are low, then that's the situation we're talking about, where we can see if there's outbreaks, where there's sufficient testing and tracing. If there's not in any of these red states, there is no way that they are locking down, that they are opening up the schools again in the fall, because they're going to be locked down before then. And if they're not, it is unwise to open up the schools in any of these red states or any states that are on the edge of becoming a red state. And so the answer varies a lot by this. Next, do the answers vary by high-risk students, educators, or families? So this is such a challenging question. So we've talked in previous weeks, let me jump to this slide, that minorities, in particular Blacks, but also Hispanics, are much more likely to get infected. So whether it's choice of getting infected, not a choice, but whether it's the risk of getting infected, minorities tend to live in bigger households, and they tend to live in smaller places because rent might be expensive. And so because of that, and additionally to that, a lot of the minorities are more likely to be at these demanding jobs where during the lockdown they still had to go to work because we needed the folks at the Amazon warehouses and these other places, and there tended to be more minorities in some of these crucial jobs. So then among those who are infected, minorities are more likely to require hospitalization. And then among those that require hospitalizations, minorities are more likely to die. So it's a triple whammy here. And in fact, just to drive this point home, minorities represent around 40% of the US population, and yet they represent around 82% of COVID-19 deaths under the age of 65. I mean, let me say this again. I mean, I'll say it the opposite way. Non-Hispanic whites represent around 60% of the US population, but they only represent around 20% of COVID-19 deaths under the age of 65. This is huge. Minorities are at extremely high risk from this disease. We need to be paying attention to this. This is enormous. These are American citizens who are being they're at higher risk for this disease, for every part of it, for getting infected, for getting hospitalized, and from dying. And so we need to have a much more massive response. And so when it comes to talking about higher risk students, educators, or families, right now I'm just pointing out minorities in terms of risk, but there's other risk too. There's people with comorbidities, people who are for any kind of disease that might increase their risk if they were to get SARS-CoV-2 infected. We need to be looking at that and balancing it. And so maybe kids who are at higher risk should have special policies put in place for them. But there's the other flip side to the coin here that we need to pay attention to. So there's not an easy answer. The stakes are really high here for high-risk students, educators, or families. And that is not only is the risk of COVID-19 higher, the risk of not going back to school is higher for them. So the problem is when you're looking at remote learning, on average, minorities don't have as much access to the wealthier schools that have the advanced technology, that have the Zoom classes every day. And so as a result, minorities during the lockdowns end up, or if they're working remotely and not going to school, they are much more likely to have no instruction at all, or if they do have instruction, to have low quality remote instruction. And this has impacts that could last their lifetime if they're not keeping up with their peers because they're not even given the same education of white people. And so this is a major issue. The stakes are high. it does not become an easier answer here. We know that the risk is high of disease, but the risk of not going back to school is at least as high also. So I don't have an easy answer here. All I have is further questions, but I mean, I warned you going into this that I don't have good answers, but at least we have the data to be describing. This is what epidemiologists are thinking about as we talk about the question of reopening. Next, will opening schools lead to a second wave and more lockdowns? So a review based on some of the other things we discussed is that if the caseload, a lot of these are global studies, so this makes more sense globally. In the US, we're still on our first wave. We never got past our first wave. And so this doesn't really make sense when it comes on a state-by-state level. A lot of the studies that have looked at this are looking globally. And so globally, it's unlikely. It's a little bit mixed here in terms of it. We've been looking at case studies in Ireland, France, Australia, and it looks like there's almost 0 cases of in-school transmission. And so the risk generally is low. But then again, I shared with you a little earlier, this question, Israel is part of it too. So there's strong evidence supporting that the kids going back to school, that it's completely safe and there's not going to be spread. And then there's also strong evidence in Israel that it did cause an outbreak. So it's tough. This is not a common thing, what we saw, and we don't know what was different about Israel versus every other country in the world where the schools were open and there were not these outbreaks. So that's still being investigated. So again, let me talk about the risks of not reopening. So there's a bunch of risks. The major one, of course, not getting the education that they need. That has persistent effects that will follow them throughout the course of their education, and as they compete for jobs in the marketplace. This education damage that they're getting now, if they're not getting great education, will persist with them for years. And so it really, truly is a problem. Additionally, there's other things we may not even think about. So school officials account for approximately 20% of formal reports of child abuse and domestic violence. One of the things that we're expecting is that with the lockdowns and more people staying at home, is that there are probably, and there have been increased reports of increased child abuse and domestic violence. But if these kids don't go to school, then there is no reporting of them for a large percentage. And there's all these additional issues that we have to think about with kids not going to school. So what should we do? So when you look at the executive summary, I'll get to some additional references here, but the only thing we can say is there is a lack of scientific consensus about the impact of school closures and reopenings on community transmission of SARS-CoV-2. Epidemiology won't help you here. If you're a community trying to make a decision, there's evidence for it and evidence against it. I'll talk about some other things here, but it's really a challenge. There's no clear answer here. For some of the answers, they're clear. The very first thing I showed you, are the kids personally at risk? We know that answer. They're at quite low risk. At least we know that answer, but there's so much uncertainty in the other things that I've discussed. Let me just describe a couple of other things. So if your school decides to reopen, I would push back and say, well, yes, there's all these great examples, all this great data of schools that have done quite well, but how can you prove to me that this is not going to be like Israel, that we won't have an outbreak? It's a reasonable question to ask. And vice versa, if the school decides not to open, well, similarly, there's the damage of not necessarily getting the education quality because it's not in person. And so there's maybe pushback on that. Let me talk about a few things. Among every school, and so this is one way through, among every single school that opens, it must have rapid school-based COVID-19 daily symptom screening, not necessarily daily, but regular screening, so regular testing, and by regular, I mean frequent testing, universal contact tracing, and isolation. So all this has to be up and running as strong as we have it in New Jersey and New York City. There's no excuse about contact tracing. There can be no school openings if you do not have an army of contact tracers if it were to break out with students getting infected. Because the only way to know if like Israel, where you had some of these outbreaks in some of the schools, would be if you were regularly doing the testing and contact tracing. So it is essential, regardless. So if the choice is made to reopen, then all of these things have to be true, that you have regular system screening, heavy testing, contact tracing, and isolation. And what this means is that most states are not anywhere near ready. Should not be considering opening schools at all. Any state in red is not opening in the fall. I can tell you right now, whatever they're planning, they're not opening. If they do, they're going to be in trouble, most likely. And the orange ones are also very unlikely to be opening. But there's a couple other things I wanted to show you here. So you might have been aware of the American Academy of Pediatrics. They came out and made a recommendation that kids should go back to school for some of the reasons that I said. The risk was very low. Outside of Israel, the risk has been extremely low for all the major questions, the 7 other questions that I just went through. And so their reopening, their policy assumes both that every single one of these criteria will be met, that there will be extreme amount of screening and testing, huge contact tracing, isolation, it will be ready and available, and that the symptom screening will be going on, and that states would be ready to reopen based on the surrounding, the ambient amount of virus that's in circulation would be low. That is assumed under the American Academy of Pediatrics. There are 2 great references. If you want to know about these things in particular, I recommend you go to these 2 places, because these are the best sources right now to go for looking at global policies on schools, where there's a lot of data that's been collected, and US policies on schools. So Johns Hopkins has put together this amazing website. Here's the website address here, on every single policy across the state, both at the state level, federal level, everything available of all the different policies that you can compare if you're looking at this and what it looks like. On the global level, I apologize that this website is enormous, so it's probably easier just to Google, search for the title of it, maybe the date or the author, and just Google it. This is an amazing reference of the school reopening models, implementations, the policies at the global level. All of this stuff you might find extremely helpful as you make your decisions. And yeah, so that was it for this. Are there any questions? I saw some people presenting questions. I don't have Rebecca here today to help with that. Can you please unmute yourself and ask your questions?
Glenn?
Yes.
I have lots of questions. I'm kind of thinking each week I kind of think, aren't we getting closer to herd immunity? But I know you're going to say no, and that's not really my question. But it seems like things are kind of almost imploding, and that at some point the good news will be that we'll be at herd immunity. However, my question is, we were promised or it was suggested that there was going to be quick testing for everybody. And I know the White House uses it all the time, and it seems that it was something that was offered and they were going to be working on it. Wouldn't that really lift all of these issues, like opening restaurants or opening schools or whatever it might be? And what's the holdup?
So what you're envisioning is more than we can really even imagine, because say you were to have so many tests available that if you wanted to be seated at a restaurant, it would require getting tested. And if you wanted to go to school every day or go and use an Uber, then you'd have a test at every of those points. And that would require multiple point tests per person. There's over 300 million people in the United States. That would require going through many billions of tests every week. And we're not anywhere near that level. The level that we're at, I don't know if I have a good testing number. In terms of the total number of tests, no, this is the positivity rate. So we're at approximately, so we're under 1 million daily tests. So we just do not have enough tests. And we saw that a lot of these places are not testing enough. And that's the number here, where you don't get positive rates this high unless you're simply not screening enough of the population. If you're screening the population, even if the positive rate was going up a little bit, you'd see it going up 2% or maybe to 3%. but right now there's not enough testing going on. And so when you look at the total number of tests, we're not going to be within it's outside of what we can even imagine.
I know, but after it's 4 months now since the initial lockdown. Why aren't these tests in place by now? I mean, why are people online for 14 hours?
Failure of governance. So the federal.
Could it have been? I mean, feasible?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the powers of the executive branch, so the federal government, is to, in wartime situations, in security situations, in situations just like this, one of their executive powers is to take over manufacturing plants for the sake of the country and say, for the next number of months, you will only be producing
PPE.
tests. Exactly, all of these things. And our current president has used this authority in numerous other ways, not for COVID-19, but when it's come to COVID-19, it's been handfuls of times that he's used it. And that is a failure. That was a choice, and it explains why we do not have sufficient testing. And the state, it's been every state for themselves. In some places, not even the states, it's the local areas for themselves. And they have no control when it comes to that level in terms of controlling getting the tests and making them available. And so this is a failure of leadership. Typically, it's unfortunate to say, but the blue states have been doing a little bit better. California has not. But when it comes to testing and tracing, in fact, let me come back here. So this shows. Oh, in fact, this doesn't show. But when it comes to testing and tracing, let me show Florida. So Florida, unfortunately, is not contact tracing. So it's out of control. There's nothing to slow it down. The infection rate is now near exponential. It's not as high as it was back in March in much of the country, or in the Northeast when we got hit really bad. But it's still quite high. It's out of control. The positive test rate, this 20%, the only way to get up that high is if there's no screening being done. Is if they're just testing the symptomatic people, they're prioritizing putting the tests in the hospitals, and that's just not enough testing. So Florida is an example of a state that did not make the right choice in terms of governance. There are a bunch of other states out there, but I mean, just what I showed you earlier, or when we were talking about March, the number of hotspots was quite a lot less. But now we're talking about an explosion of different hotspots. It's not just an explosion of like just a few hotspots and lots and lots and lots of people in those hotspots. Like in New York City, just as an example, in a bunch of different neighborhoods, you might have had 20 to 30% of the population being infected there. So that was a huge number of people being infected in that one space. Here, you have enormous numbers of new hotspots, each one a separate hotspot. And there's less people infected at each one of these individual hotspots, but there's no way to get it under control without going into lockdown in a lot of these. I mean, look at the South. It is very red. And so there's no easy way to get through that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Did you have other questions? Anybody else? Otherwise, I could jump. It's already a little bit past the hour. There's a couple other websites that I've been finding interesting. One is Vaccine Tracker. Some of you might not know, but there's a vaccine that's been approved in a country. That country is China. I think it's mostly used for the military there, so it's still experimental. Like it wouldn't be approved in the United States because it would be too experimental for us to use here. But technically, there is a country that exists now, so China does have approved vaccine so far. There's 4 vaccines in phase 3. Oh, and so one last thing to end it out. I see I'm at the end of time. One last thing. I'm going to go back to the tuberculosis. We've talked about this previously, the BCG vaccine. And so interestingly, where is it? So interestingly, there was another study done over the last week or two looking at oh, here it is. So looking at the relationship between, so BCG vaccine, again, this was for tuberculosis. It's been found over time to also prevent other respiratory illnesses and other kinds of diseases. I think even leprosy, it's been found to protect. So random other illnesses, it seems to stimulate the T cells and other parts of the immune system that don't require antibodies. So it's sort of this peripheral halo effect. And so the BCG vaccine is this vaccine we're talking about. I mentioned it 2 months ago. The vaccines have been, trials have been going on. We may have results from this trial by the end of this month or sometime in August. We'll have a readout of that vaccine, of these vaccine trials. And so this is coming, this new study has looked more closely than the previous studies at what might be going on with this vaccine in terms of the relationship. And again here, the states that have the strongest BCG vaccination programs historically, those states have been much, much less likely to have COVID-19 deaths. The more people in those countries that got the BCG vaccine, the less deaths. This is fascinating. At first, we didn't know if it was a correlation, just a fluke, but it looks like it could still be a correlation, but it looks like the effect could truly be real. And so there are, of course, whenever there's a question about a correlation, the best source of evidence that we have, I've mentioned this previously, is a randomized controlled clinical trial. And then even better than that is when you have a meta-analysis of multiple randomized controlled clinical trials. But so the first randomized controlled trial will be released in probably as soon as the end of the month, if not sooner, or by August, sometime before the end of summer. So this is good news. Again, this is a vaccine that's given to people when they're kids typically, and it might have a different effect of giving a tuberculosis vaccine to a 60-year-old or a 70-year-old. And so the vaccine trials that are in place are largely aimed at frontline workers. So at hospital physicians, nurses, and other people on the front line of treating COVID-19. So that risk profile we'll probably get to see really well if it's effective in older people and not just in the young kids who are vaccinated. All right, and I'm going to open it up. I'll just unmute. Are there any other questions, or is that it for today? Oh, Becky's not here. I'm not sure how to unmute everyone.
Okay.
Any other questions, or should we call it a day?
No, I'm fine. Thank you, Glenn. It was wonderful again.
Thanks, everyone. Speak to you 7 o'clock next week. Have a great week.
Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.